If you want to know how to memorize and then remember concepts, literally calling them back on demand, you basically just need memory techniques that can handle conceptual information. Now, whether it's something like the mathematical proofs that this author is using to prove that infinity essentially doesn't exist, or it's something in physics like orchestrated objective reduction, or maybe it's something philosophical like the kinds of things that I have studied in Advaita Vedanta, for example, the good news is that I'm going to teach you everything I know about how to use memory techniques to commit all kinds of things to memory that are heavily conceptual. Now, my knowledge on this is really based on lots and lots of experiences. So I taught critical thinking at university, and it was based in logic and all kinds of things. I studied logic when I was an undergrad, and I've just written lots of books on memory techniques, and one of them, The Victorious Mind, talks about how I memorized a lot of things related to an ancient philosophy called Advaita Vedanta. And, I'm just memorizing concepts all the time, like learning the physics of orchestrated objective reduction, which I'm very interested in because it has to do with memory. And I literally just memorized that title itself within seconds because I noticed that if I didn't use memory techniques, I would completely forget what the heck it was called. So it's not that I really understand the deep physics of it, but I come to understand it by memorizing the words and terms and the meanings that are involved in it just by simply using these techniques. So basically, the tools that you need boil down to 5 mnemonic systems. And when you combine these mnemonic devices together for effective recall, you will be able to memorize concepts no matter how difficult you might think that they are. So if you're ready to dive into this tutorial on turning even the most abstract information into concrete ideas that you will easily remember, smash that thumbs up, get subscribed if you're new here, and we're going to dive deep into this. So I mentioned that there's 5 systems. They're like steps that you can follow. But before we get into that, you want to just get used to the idea that abstraction has a meaning. And you might feel that something's abstract, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, when we abstract ideas, we're literally pulling away from them to get a better picture of what they are. So this is a kind of important thing, is just challenge yourself. Is this really abstract, or is it the case that I haven't actually abstracted it? This is really, really important. It sounds like it's intellectually noodling, but a lot of people just haven't done the work, and that's why it feels very confusing to them. But that doesn't mean that it's abstract. It's certainly not in the world of conceptualization. So this opening step is really essential because you may be stuck thinking that concepts are much more abstract than they might be in reality, right? It may just be that you don't have the individual parts that actually require you to abstract and pull away from the words in order to see a big picture view, or literally to abstract the concept from the words, right? So very, very important. It's just a huge step. Don't miss it. Okay, so assuming that you are not fooling yourself into thinking that something is abstract when it isn't, or you are at least following the steps that it takes in order to get where you have something to memorize, one thing that I would suggest that you do is just memorize the names of things. Don't worry yet about whether you understand what it is or not. Now, I've heard a lot of my fellow memory experts say, don't memorize something you don't understand. I disagree. Maybe not totally disagree in every single context, but I came to understand a lot of the Sanskrit phrases that I've memorized while studying Advaita Vedanta only after memorizing them. Just memorizing the term Advaita Vedanta itself helped me understand what the philosophy is talking about, right? And then there's little practices that I've done as well, like Kirtan Kriya. I couldn't know what that was without memorizing the term, and then it really helps me understand better what I'm doing. So it's really, really important to not necessarily just follow these recommendations. Oh, don't memorize something that you don't understand. This might sound counterintuitive, but the name of a concept is core information, and it is well worth memorizing, even if you don't understand it yet. I still don't think that I fully understand orchestrated objective reduction, and maybe I never will, but at the end of the day, by memorizing it, it already gives me something within my mind to think about the various parts, like the Hemingway paradox and block time theory, and on and on and on. And it just gives a foundation, an actual ground to step on. So if you think of a concept as a room, how could you step into a room that doesn't have a floor? Well, knowing the names that are used by the experts is kind of like, maybe this is not the best analogy, but in my mind, it's kind of like identifying the floor so you can actually walk on it, right? I remember when Victor Vitanza was the external on my PhD dissertation defense. External means the person who comes not only from outside of your department, but from outside of the university itself in order to grill you at your dissertation defense. He had asked me, he said, what is the philosophical grounding for your claims in your dissertation? And I said, grounding? You mean like ontology or epistemology or metaphysics or what? And not to go deep into that story, but he said all of those things, essentially. And so I was able to provide that grounding. And where did I start? With words, right? And knowing what ontology means, knowing what metaphysics means, knowing what epistemology means. All of those things had to be remembered at some point. So this is, to me, literally the floor, the grounding, right? What do we call these things? And then from there, you just have a much better foundation by which to memorize the meanings. And if you really think about the memory palace technique that we'll talk about a little bit more today, if you have that floor to walk into, then you can actually use the same room that you memorized the word in for a concept to memorize the meaning of the concept, or at least some of the parts that belong to the meaning, because some of these things have many moving parts. But you got to start somewhere, right? So exactly how to memorize the names for concepts, we'll get to. But the basic point here is that I always have a lot of room for all the concepts that I want to commit to memory, and I urge you to make sure, if you're not already using something like the magnetic memory method, to use something like the magnetic memory method to make sure that you have multiple memory palaces, so when you come across the name of a concept, so that you can say it by name and then start to layer in its definition, bam, you're prepared. You have what you need in order to do it. And then you're just going to be able to proceed much, much faster. And it's just not workable without the memory palaces in place. Now, the other thing about this is to question the names of the concepts and rotate them around. So with orchestrated objective reduction, like what is being orchestrated here? What are we being objective about? What is being reduced in this orchestration, right? So just what, and then how is it being done? Who's the one who's doing it? One of my favorite questions is if this turns out to be correct, who benefits, right? And just asking this is a kind of mental rotation. And I call it mental rotation very specifically because you're looking for more angles. And just by asking classic who, what, where, when, why, and how questions, you're rotating it around and you're starting to be able to not just remember the name of the concept, but start to identify its parts. And even if you don't know the answer, you are now adding hallways to this foundational ground or floor that you've put into the memory palace. And then you can think, okay, so orchestration. Well, this has all kinds of meanings and parts. I'll place that here in a memory palace. Oh, objective. Well, we're going to put that over here, and on and on and on, right? So no matter what it is, by asking these questions, you're mentally rotating around the various angles, and you're just giving yourself avenues to explore further so that you know what you need to fill in the blanks. This process itself is mnemonic. It will help you remember things by reflective thinking. There's lots and lots of evidence about this. So what's the next step? Well, what you want to do is something like translation. So what do I mean by translation? Well, I mean starting to apply magnetic associations. And magnetic associations are not just mnemonic images, but mnemonic images that have particular components that I call the magnetic modes. And what you're going to do is you're going to translate the words mentally into multisensory associations. So if we take something like orchestrated objective reduction, right? I'm just thinking, okay, what orchestra can I think of? And in this particular case, I thought of Frank Zappa conducting something. I think one of his pieces that I used to like a lot a long time ago was called The Yellow Shark. And, he's just conducting an orchestration or an orchestra, and it's orchestrated, right? And objective, literally, there is a Frank Zappa thing in his world where he talks about objects in a quite a funny way. And then reduction, of course, is just having him reduce this down to the smallest component, this orchestra, in the palm of his hand. So now I know the term, and this is all placed in a memory palace, of course, so that I can refer back to where this image is. So let's say that all of that with Frank Zappa is happening right here behind me on this wall. Then when I need to think back to it, boom, it's right there. Now you can do this kind of thing without a memory palace, but the whole point of having the memory palace is scale, so that you can add more ideas and then use recall rehearsal. Now you might be thinking, does any of this actually work? Well, as reported in Scientific American, amongst many, many other places, crafting, making, assigning, striking images is especially powerful in dense fields like science and medicine, and I would assume by extension physics and anything that has to do with conceptual information, right? So to give you another simple example, when I memorized this term Advaita Vedanta, let's just take Advaita. I took the most famous advertising expert I know and mixed him with Steve Vai. So advertising person plus Vai creates a core image that makes Advaita. Now you might be thinking, well, why don't you call it Advaita? Well, this just has to do with the knowledge of how that V's are sounded as W's in certain languages, right? And that image just makes it stick to memory, plus the knowledge of the pronunciation of the alphabet. So this isn't really about how do you remember the pronunciation of alphabets, but the point is you could use the same tools to memorize the pronunciation of various alphabets and how that they change depending on the grammar, and on and on and on. Then I just need to add a few more associations for the meaning, right? And so we've got the associations for the term, and then we have the associations for the meaning. And in this case, Advaita Vedanta, how would we say? It's like, not to. The culmination of the knowledge in the Vedas, which is the Ved in Vedanta, the culmination of the knowledge in the Vedas is not to. That's basically what that means, right? Now, understanding that is a whole different kettle of fish, and you want to know the ideas of Brahman and on and on and on. There's lots to memorize, but in the same memory palace, no problem. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, because it's there. Now, you might feel like you would be too slow with coming up with this kind of association, and I would suggest completing the fun and simple visualization exercises on the exercises page in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. They're sensory memory exercises that a lot of people find within 2 to 5 hours they can just do this very, very quickly. They're never at a loss for images. And so it's kind of visualization, but it's not, because you add in the magnetic modes, which make it multi-sensory. So we can go deep into what mental imagery is, or you can check out a video and a piece that I've written about mental imagery. But the idea is, the more abstract it is, the more the magnetic modes make it more and more concrete to your brain. So, the Zappa example that I gave, or the advertising executive that I gave, it's really, really simple. Hearing Steve Vai's music, for example, makes it so much more multi-sensory. So it's not really even seeing things, it's more experience things, which is what makes it so fun, right? You experience what's going on because it's highly specific. It's already in your memory. Like Steve Vai is already in my memory, so it's not inventing anything. It's not being creative or anything like that. That would just take too much time, and it would not be that fun. So really make sure you get those exercises done, because they're going to make things so fast, so easy, and they're just going to save you a lot of time. At the end of the day, time that you could use to study more conceptual information. The next step is, it's not like this is the next thing to do, but you have choices here. And it is really to make sure that these associations that we just talked about are in your memory palaces. So memory palaces for storing concepts is, it is what it is. You have to have the memory palaces in advance. But whether you come up with these associations while you're mentally in a memory palace, or you come up with them in the void of your mind and then place them in a memory palace, I do it both ways. It's not one or the other. It's a little bit of both. But in order for long-term memory to scale with many, many concepts, recall rehearsal is going to be needed. So you really have to kind of pick your battles here, right? Because sometimes you may not need spaced repetition and the kind of what scientists call active recall that memory palaces allow. So what I mean is that if I have Advaita Vedanta and Steve Vai is hanging over here with an advertising executive and they're arguing over the nature of 1 versus 2, right? If I have that here, what I want to do is revisit the memory palace because they're in this memory palace. I know what memory palace it is, and that's the point of the memory palace. You don't have to remember it. You know it thanks to logic, right? So it would be, in this case, in an A memory palace because Advaita starts with A. I don't have to think too hard. Where on earth did I put this information? No. We don't want to be messing around with that stuff. We want to just know because there's a logical reason why that it's in a particular memory palace. And that memory palace is not invented. It's based on something that's already in memory. So it's just lickety split, easy peasy, lemon squeezy to rapidly use recall rehearsal to get the information into long-term memory. So if you're new to the memory palace technique and memory skills overall, a memory palace is something that you basically, well, it's also known as the method of loci, and people pronounce loci in so many different ways it's not even funny. Sometimes it's called the journey method. The point is if you want to use it for memorizing concepts, you want to choose familiar locations, like a living room, a workplace, office, and once this is done, you're just going to split it up into specific spots or loci, and an individual locus would be here. I like to call them stations in the magnetic memory method world. It's just a little bit more modern and nobody argues about how it's pronounced. Station. This station would be here. It's a specific spot. It's a specific spot that's different than this specific spot. And you can see in the illustration on the screen that there's a memory palace based on a studio bedroom that I used to rent in Berlin around 2013 when I was on tour with a band there. And by the way, I used these same techniques to help me memorize all the songs that I had to play on that tour. And some of them were really challenging. They were conceptual, all right. In any case, what you do is then you associate each concept that you want to memorize with each spot in the memory palace by placing your associations. But again, the order in which that you do this is totally up to you. You could just in the void of your mind come up with these associations, or you could think, I am in this spot, or I am imagining this spot. I'm looking at this spot from a second person point of view, or I'm looking down at it in a omniscient point of view, right? However you do it, that's up to you. I do it different ways, different times. That's not really the key thing. But if you're a memory competitor, you may want to lock down on one specific way of doing it because you've got the clock on. And basically, memory competitors want to be the fastest and the most accurate. And I don't know that they're normally memorizing concepts. I've certainly seen them when I was the commentator at the Pan American Open 2023 memory competition. I saw them memorize cloud formations, and there's certainly something abstract in terms of abstract images there, but they're not really concepts. In any case, there's so many wonderful, wild adventures that you can go on when you get into the memory world. So, thumbs up for that. And it's just such a great realm to be involved in. The point is that once you have some associations linked to concepts that you want to remember, then you mentally walk back through the memory palace and you recall the images, right? So what's Steve Vai doing with this advertiser, right? What is Frank Zappa doing with the orchestra? And then this brings back orchestrated objective reduction, right? And it might not seem like this is all that profound. Like, what am I going to do with this? These small little bits of information at a time? How is this ever going to scale? Well, actually, the fact that you break it down into small bits of information is a good thing. And you can look into the science of chunking as a memory strategy, or chunking down, if you want to know why and how breaking things down actually makes it faster and gives you more advantages. But at the end of the day, I mean, you could use index cards, you could use flashcards on a spaced repetition software. It's always getting broken down into individual parts. That's not a problem. The problem is, basically, are you showing up consistently? And are you doing what works? And it can be that you use spaced repetition software. You don't have to use memory palaces. But if you think about it, these associative techniques apply just as much to a flashcard, whether it's a physical flashcard in your hand or a digital software flashcard. It applies in exactly the same way because those things are loci or locus, individual locus, right? They're spaces. And what I mean by this is a card that I made once upon a time to help me remember the symbol in logic for operator. And this is a memory palace. It's not the standard memory palace from the ancient tradition, like using a home, but it is a place. It is a station in the world. And I can mentally think back to it and go, what does this symbol, while I'm reading the book that uses this, which is in, some people call it dialetheism, but I always call it dialetheism. I don't know, I might be wrong about that, but I like to call it dialetheism. The point is that there are these symbols used there in order to deal with the concept of what is an operator in a logical sequence of symbols that help us get to the idea of what might be a true contradiction, right? And that's just what I think back to, is this card in this particular case. But I did take a moment to put it in a memory palace, but I noticed in this particular case that I actually didn't need the memory palace because I was just thinking about what was on the card. Incidentally, in a book called Happiness Beyond Thought by Gary Weber and another one called Evolving Beyond Thought, I memorized a lot of the stuff that Gary Weber talks about there, which is really heavy conceptual, or at least it was for me in the beginning. I was like, what is this? And by memorizing it, I came to understand it. And I asked him about his own memorization process. And he said that, he's never used a memory palace, not familiar with it at all, but he has the experience of, or at least as I remember what he was saying, he has the experience of the page being part of his mind, right? The location of the Sanskrit on the page. And that's kind of what this is, right? So basically you can have information wherever you want it in the world. It's going to have a location, right? And that location can be very, very useful for you if you think about the location. But you're going to break the information down. It's going to be chunked down into smaller parts. And frankly, I think I now understand the philosophy, even though I see that people call it dialetheism, but I call it dialetheism, and there's a reason why I call it that. That has to do with that aletheia is the Greek word for truth, which means unhiding, and die means two, so dialetheism. But in any case, the point is that I broke that word down into parts. I've learned a lot of it very, very quickly, and it's the breaking down that helped me learn it so fast. So this technique has done this for many great conceptual thinkers throughout history, and I'm talking about people like Plato, Simonides of Kos, the author of the Rhetorica ad Herennium. Some people used to think that it was Cicero, but that's been, nobody thinks that anymore anyway. A lot of people think that, but nobody who studies these things thinks that. St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Giordano Bruno, Robert Flood, on and on and on. You can learn a lot about these thinkers on my YouTube channel. You can learn about them in Yeats's The Art of Memory, really interesting book. The point is that everybody breaks things down. So this is a long way of saying you can scale even if you move very slowly. And the tortoise and the hare, right? The tortoise wins at the end of the day, and he takes it one step at a time instead of tiring himself out by racing through uselessly. Now, we've talked about optimizing for recall rehearsal by making sure we have lots of memory palaces and then revisiting the associations that we put in the memory palaces. Recall rehearsal is the word that I prefer to use for scientific principles like active recall and spaced repetition. And the reason why I like recall rehearsal is because it's specific to the use of memory palaces. And memory palaces, to me, are not like movie theaters. They're more like theaters with stages. And the reason why I think that way is because, people say, I like that my memory is like a movie and I can replay things like a movie. And I always think, well, okay, cool. I mean, whatever. But for me, it's more like I am the theater director and I'm looking in the memory palace as a stage and I'm telling my actors, which are the associations like an advertising executive with Steve Vai, and I'm saying, do that thing to perform the meaning, the sound of the words and the meaning, right? And that's a very specific thing to me. It's rehearsal, right? So I'm getting them to recall through the rehearsal of the information to develop long-term memory. Now, right or wrong, a lot of people learn about the memory palace technique through Sherlock Holmes. And as a result, they come to think of this technique as a kind of storage. And it can be to a certain extent, but that's really not the point. It's certainly not what I find in Aristotle's writing on the memory palace, right? What we find there is that we want to use the memory palace technique for spaced repetition and active recall. Now, in Aristotle, it's kind of like a proto version of this, and I've talked about it in Aristotle's Nuclear Alphabet, which is a video tutorial you may want to check out. It's the fastest and most reliable way to usher the concepts you need to learn into long-term memory. And yes, you can use flashcards for concept retention, but the point is to self-test through whatever means that you're using effective strategies. So using the memory palace for me makes it so easy, and because it saved my life, basically, and it got me my PhD and helped me learn languages so that when I got the Mercator visiting professor scholarship, or grant, better said, I was able to actually learn German quick enough to give a talk in German, and to be able to lecture in another language. I don't think I would ever have been able to do it with flashcards. I just find it too boring. It's rote learning, right? But you could do it. The point is the memory palace is so good for this because you can have 10 concepts in a memory palace. You can have 10 words in a memory palace. You can have 10 phrases in a memory palace. You can have my entire TEDx talk that I gave once upon a time in a memory palace. And all you have to do is mentally walk through the space, and you think about the associations that you place there, but then go through the process in different orders: forward, backward, middle to the end, middle to the beginning, and then you skip these stations to give what's called primacy and recency effect to each bit of information. This is where the chunking part is also an advantage. By breaking it down, you can give each and every little bit of information equal doses or near equal doses of primacy and recency. So those are a lot of science words that I memorized once upon a time. They're conceptual, but they become very, very concrete when you actually use them. And I know it can feel challenging, but we know from plenty of memory science that your brain actually needs challenges like this in order to form memories. A lot of passive learning is actually hurting people because they're not actively challenging the brain. So the brain is a physical thing. In the memory, I'm not a neuroscientist, but there's these things called the nodes of Ranvier, and various chemicals flow and exchange positive and negative ions and so forth. And then the synapses can fire at more optimal rates and more completely, depending on how that you've optimized the amounts of myelin sheaths that grow around these synapses and tightly bind in there. And then there's the dendritic spines. And the more, I don't know if this is the correct way to say this, but the more turgor pressure those dendritic spines on your neurons have, the more robust your memory is. So it can all get a bit technical. And, I may have made a mistake on some of those terms, but if I didn't, then it's only more proof of concept that the memory techniques work because I memorized all that stuff, right? And basically when you're using these techniques in this way with the principles of primacy effect and recency effect, it's so essential to just learning and forming memories as quickly as possible and having them be robust. Now, I don't know of any way to avoid mistakes. I just simply don't. And, there's a way to deal with it, though, and that's called modesty and humility. And I often use just the basic rhetorical strategy of saying, I could be wrong about this, happy to be corrected, but as I remember it, it's this way, right? And that's not being weak or pathetic or anything like that. It might sound like that to some people, but I think it's actually just important because A, it's true, but B, it also is a preemptive strike against criticism that, hey, you're making claims about X, Y, and Z and so forth. And sometimes I may forget to use those rhetorical strategies, but I don't see them as super strategies. I just see them as having fun and covering the bases, right? So don't try to avoid mistakes, but do definitely, I would recommend, have preemptive strikes, especially if you're going to deal with conceptual information, because a lot of these things are very difficult, and the rate of error goes up the more difficult the concepts are. And anyway, if you want to know more about the science here, basically it all comes down to not necessarily understanding every little bit of the science, but deliberately practicing in a way that actually works. And how it's going to work for you is going to take a little bit of your own practice, fiddling around. Some of these things are knacky, so to speak. And I have found over the years, and I would argue that this is quite correct, is that as knacky as they are, as individualized as they need to be, they tend to be exactly the same for all of us, precisely because the brain is physical. And I'm not saying that there might not be an extra physical part of the brain, but if we do the studies and we analyze the brain, these are the things that we see physically. And when people don't do these things, and this includes memory champions and other people who have been scanned, we just don't see those things, right? So the correlation is quite strongly there. Anyway, you do you, but I would recommend that you definitely put in the time and the practice to understand these techniques and practice them, because they're going to be huge, especially if you're a person who needs to remember concepts with a higher rate of accuracy, noting that mistakes will happen, but you now have a way to deal with mistakes in advance. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about beyond memory techniques. Memory techniques are fantastic. Everybody knows that I love them. But I don't think that we should treat the memory palace or even memory techniques as, the hammer that deals with every nail. Although, what I'm about to talk to you about is actually just another kind of memory technique. And that's using, for example, active reading strategies, taking notes from books. And the way you take notes can be very simple, or it can be very sophisticated, like using the Zettelkasten technique, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Making sure that you choose the best possible study places is going to help you. That's a memory technique, right? I've talked a lot about how you can learn faster on this channel, on the Magnetic Memory Method blog and the podcast, and I highly recommend that you model how that I go about memorizing textbooks and using Zettelkasten, or at least learn more about it, because I'm not the only person who uses it, right? But just understand that combining effective note-taking and studying in very, very well-chosen places and using active reading strategies is exactly how I passed my PhD at York University. And I did so far ahead of my peers who entered the humanities program the same year. So take it or leave it, but that is the case. That's how it worked out. And you can retain even the most complex concepts, I believe, in exactly the same way. But everything starts by deeply engaging the concepts you need to remember by asking questions about them above all, and actually memorizing their names above all, because that becomes a nice slippery water slide of the mind, so to speak, that takes you into foundational areas. You don't want to be passive about it. It's not just going to happen by osmosis, or very rarely, right? Literally say the name of the concept out loud. Start to make it concrete through an association process immediately. Put it into a memory palace at some point in the game. Use the mental tools we've discussed today in the ways that we've discussed them. Maybe you won't use it forever and a day. Maybe you won't fall in love with it like I am. You won't, just put mustard on it and eat it. But at the end of the day, you can't really know it if you don't use it for long enough to understand what Aristotle was talking about. I mean, it's not even that you have to take my word for it. I teach it, but this didn't come out of nowhere. This is thousands of years old. And the only time that I see it not working is when people either don't work the actual techniques as described, or they don't know the techniques, and they don't know it either because they haven't encountered them correctly, or they're using incomplete or memory competitor versions of it, and so forth. And that leads to a higher rate of mistake making, and then people throw their hands up in the air and say, well, this doesn't work, right? And I do my best to explain these things. I know that I don't necessarily always have the best way of describing it so it's clear for everyone under the sun, but so far so good. And, the ultimate thing that I can share is, don't worry about making mistakes. A lot of people say, I want to learn this correctly from the beginning. And I mean, when I say a lot of people, I have had thousands and thousands of emails over the years. And people say, I want to learn this correctly without making any mistakes. And that's not the way this is going to work, as far as I can tell. You need to make mistakes. You need to make mistakes in order to learn the technique. And I mean, if we think of the memory competition world, I don't know a single competitor who still doesn't make some mistakes, right? And in the world that I inhabit, which is language learning, studying philosophy, and helping other people by like memorizing my carpal tunnel bones and that kind of stuff, wow, I know more about anatomy than I ever imagined I would. But at the end of the day, like, I just do this stuff to demonstrate that it works for lots of things. At the end of the day, I do make mistakes sometimes. And then I just acknowledge it humbly, and I go back and fix the error. The key is to always make sure that you're actually memorizing the main points of the concept, whether you understand it or not. And then you're reflecting on it. You're asking questions about it. And once you have that process in mind, along with the memory palace technique, or if you choose to use a sort of flashcard version, which is still locations in space, you're going to be able to memorize entire passages if you want. And you're going to be able to do it relatively quickly, especially if you're using the memory palace technique. And if you need more help with that, go to magneticmerrymethod.com, get the free course there, or just dive immediately into the full Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. You're going to have so much fun, and really what you need to do is just start to apply it without worrying about whether you make mistakes. And you'll be joining the ranks of all the philosophers that I mentioned today, not to mention many, many more, not to mention joining the ranks of all kinds of cool memory competitors and many top performers of the mind. There's all kinds of people who have used memory techniques in the business world. Entrepreneurs love to be able to remember people's names, for example. Maybe that's not concepts and so forth, but they sometimes do memorize accounting concepts, for example, various things that have to do with supply chains and whatnot. So it's concepts all the way down at the end of the day. So what do you say? Are you in? If you want some more information and you want to use index cards in the most sophisticated way that I know, but still keep it pretty super simple, you want to check out either my video on the Zettelkasten technique next, or my blog post, or my podcast version of it over at magneticmerrymethod.com, or on the YouTubes, or wherever it is. But the Zettelkasten is so cool, it's not even funny. I mean, according to the professor that I learned it from, the CIA even used it to catch a spy. So what are you waiting for? Check out the Zettelkasten technique next.